Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Beneath Us All. Now, I have not heard of this film prior to me checking this out, I meant to say, and it wasn't until recently when I had been reached out by one of the producers in the movie, and Joseph Williamson, who had asked if I'd be interested in checking out this film and do a review for it. And I will say this up front too, that I did say to him that if I didn't like the movie, would you still want me to review the film? Because lately, and I would say in the last year or so, I've only stuck with films that I really liked that I would want to review. Because in the past, when I did review films I did not like, at that time, I don't think I handled it quite well, with the exception of a few films here and there that I did review that I didn't like. And I said some things I liked about it and still insisted people checking out the film, but I wasn't as motivated to review films I did not like. So I was upfront with Joseph and said, if I didn't like the film, would you still want me to talk about it? And he had said, yes, go for it. I said, fair enough. So I checked out this film recently. I actually rented it on Amazon, and I will say that I didn't like the film that much. There was quite a few things I did like about the film, but there was quite a few more things I did not like about it, because for me, I don't know too much about the behind the scenes of what it took to make the film, but there's no doubt in my mind that they put a lot of work into making this movie. It's clearly obvious when you see the film, in my opinion. But the issues that I did have with the film, which I'll point out in this review, I meant to say, really did come from more of a execution of certain character arcs that we get to see in this movie. Now, the film in itself, in reality, when I saw the movie, I got more of a dramatic film than I did a horror film, because there was a lot more of a character story that we're following here. But the problem that I had with the character story, it was the fact that and how it was handled in certain points of the film, that I felt like you had a really good setup, but then the way that it was executed just didn't work all that well for me personally. But there were elements in the film, as I said before, that I really did appreciate and I really did enjoy. But my overall experience with the film, and I've seen this movie twice so far at this point, each time I just didn't like the film as much. But that's not to say that with me getting to this review, that there weren't some great qualities. There were, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this film, along with things I didn't like about it as well too. But I will also point out too that I will not be getting to any spoilers with this review, because this movie came out back in September last month. And considering that we're in the Halloween season, this is actually the first film that I'm reviewing for the month of October that I'm going to be getting into here. And there's one film that I'm really excited to get into later this month that is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and it's one of my favorite films that is done by a director that I'm a major fan of here. Not a fan of all of his work, but when I talk about the film, you'll know who I'm referring to here once I get to that review. But this will be the starting point here for me to talk about a film that I was not familiar with here, was happy to check out, and although I didn't like the film as much, there were some great qualities I mentioned before that I'll be getting into here. So I will not get into any spoilers here, but I will get into the positives, my negatives, and then my rating. Julie is a foster child heading for her 18th birthday when she finds something buried with something unspeakable inside. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive with this film, I'm going to say this straight up right now, that there was quite a few things about this movie that I really did not like. And that's not to say I hated the film. I don't think the movie is terrible by any means. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about what I don't like about the film, which I'll get into the negatives here, that the movie just wasn't that good. There were some great qualities that the film has, which I'll get into right now, but I just want to emphasize real quickly that with my positive now, the things that I did like about the film really just has to do with the story in itself. As far as the fact that this is a horror film, to me, I always found more of the character pieces of the film to be much more interesting than the actual horror in itself, because as much as this is a horror film, which is certainly advertised to be, and it certainly is, there's no denying that at all, but I always feel like the more interesting parts of the story have to do with the characters themselves and seeing what they have to go through as far as their day-to-day struggles are concerned, and getting to learn more about them and see them go through more or less their day-to-day routine to get a better understanding of who they are as people, if you will, and learn more about them, their struggles, and what they have to do to overcome their said struggles. So I did appreciate that aspect of the story, because with the character of Julie, who we find out in the film that she's going to be turning 18, and considering that she's in the foster care system, her foster parents, you learn that really early on that they're not really the greatest people. But I also happen to notice too that they're not the worst as well either. They certainly are not the best, I would say, parents, but in comparison to when you see various other stories you've heard about, how foster parents are abusive to a lot of the foster kids, and various other films we've seen that we see portrayals of that as well too. as far as I'm concerned, not to say that they're great, but you get to see that they're not the worst either, but they're certainly not the greatest either. So I did appreciate the fact that you can see that these parents, these foster parents, are not really abusing the children, as far as I can tell. I mean, they do have moments of abuse, like one particular scene, and there's a lot of like they are clearly just using the foster care system for monetary gains. And the father, played by Sean Whalen, who a lot of people may recognize him for his work in Twister, and there's a commercial back in the 90s he did for the Got Milk ads, which I thought was really hilarious, especially at that time. I actually think he was really good in the movie as well, too. And you get to learn that he is a degenerate gambler, and that he's just trying to have that one big win where he can earn a lot of money, so that way they don't have to foster these kids anymore, as a way to earn an income and be able to get rid of the kids and just go off with his wife and live a life that he wants to live. But I also did appreciate too that we get to have some time with certain characters to get to learn more about them, and I did appreciate that aspect of the story. And again, as I said before, that part of the story to me was much more interesting than the actual horror elements in itself. So for me, unfortunately, that's really where my positives ends. So now I'll begin into my negatives here. Now, as far as my negatives concerned, for me personally, there were quite a few aspects of the film that I did not really appreciate. And that's not to say that I hated the film at all. I don't hate the movie at all. I actually, like I said before, I do like the film for what they were trying to accomplish here. But unfortunately for me, the way that it was executed did not necessarily work for me all that well. Now, I will not be getting into a lot of spoilers, but there are some of that area that I kind of will lean into here for you to get a perspective of what I mean by certain areas of the story that I did not really appreciate when it comes to the introduction of the vampire in Frey, where you see in the beginning of the movie that he's actually a Viking, and that, you know, back in the old Viking days, he had killed someone, and he was then caught and then put in a coffin, and it was shipped out to America and buried there, and then left there for who knows how long. And then along the way, Julie, in a very sad moment where early in the movie, she had taken in an injured bird, wanted to take care of it. Her foster father had heard the bird chirping in the house. He grabs the box in which the bird was kept in, and then confronted the children about it. Julia said, "I just wanted to take care of it." And he says, "No, we're not doing that, because this bird would have a disease or whatever else," and then kills the bird in front of the two children, which I thought was quite messed up. So I did appreciate the aspect that we get to see where this guy's clearly not thinking for the children. And I think that was an interesting aspect to more about the character as we get to see the story progress along the way. But then she ends up running away, and then somehow along the way she finds this pendant that belongs to Frey, which then sets up a line of communication with him. And then she ends up finding his burial ground, digs him up, and then he comes out of the coffin, and then he follows her to the barn, and she keeps him in his stable somewhere in the barn. And not knowing that he's a vampire, she brings him over some food. He ends up eating something that I was kind of surprised he was eating in the first place, especially when you learn he's a vampire, which was it was weird. But I'm not saying I'm not going to say that it was a dumb decision. I don't think that's really the case. I would have liked to have seen a reason for why he was able to eat something without having to drink blood for the first meal, if you will. So when you get to learn more about that particular character in Frey, I just did not really understand the purpose of his background, which didn't have much relevance to the overall story. We just learned where he came from, where he was buried, and then how he was discovered. That's pretty much the overall basis of what we get to learn about the character. Outside of that, we just know that he needs to, drink more blood to become stronger, and then he wants to, in a lot of ways, we insinuate that he wants to take over the world, if you will, to some degree, in some capacity. That's kind of the impression that I got. And Julie is the one person that can help her out. And then along the way, when we get to learn about Julie, that you see in the very beginning that she's actually quite a good person, but clearly she's very distraught, very she's been through a lot, you can certainly tell. And then along the way, she changes from being this really good person to much more of a destructive person along the way, having the influence of Frey, the vampire, that he has over her, to basically turn her into a vampire along the way, and then become more or less just like him, wanting to just eat other people. I will say that even though that can be an interesting approach in telling this character arc, the way that it was executed for me was very, I guess the best way I could describe it is it was very bland for me personally, and there was not enough substance for me personally to really get a feel for how, as far as not understanding why she did it. We understand why she did it, but just the way that it was done to provide more substance, more depth behind the character, to really get a feel for her transition from being this really nice person to a pretty mean vampire after she gets turned. And seeing that transition to from being a nice person to more or less an evil vampire, I would have liked to see a little bit more behind that to get a deeper feel for the character, so that when she makes that transition, it actually makes sense. Because in a lot of ways, it felt kind of, there was a lot of it just felt very abrupt in some ways. Like there was a purpose behind it, and it was done. Like I said, the setup was there, but the execution for me personally just didn't work for me all that well. And then when it came to the various other characters along the way too, when we get the social worker that we get introduced in this movie too, I mean, she's definitely a very integral character to the overall story. But sometimes there are some moments where the characters are introduced and we get some connection with them, but then as the story progresses along the way, it seems like some of the connection for me personally kind of got lost in the mix somewhere, where I was interested and then I lost interest along the way, especially with our main character and Julie, where she's the main focus of this film. But along the way, I just became less interested in everyone's journey as it progresses from there. Now, as far as the horror elements are concerned that we get to see in this movie, that to me personally was the least interesting part of the film. But I will say though that I did appreciate the atmosphere that the movie does create when it comes to setting up the mood, if you will. I did appreciate that, but I just didn't like the way it was actually handled as the story had progressed along the way. Now, as far as the character of Frey, the vampire in this movie, truthfully, he was the least interesting character. That's not to say that the actor who had played him was not good in the part. I just think that with the amount of time that they probably could have spent on the character, he could have been a very interesting character and a very integral character at that. One character I could say that would be very similar to his character is the vampire Lestat in the Interview with the Vampire with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. Like, that character to me was in some ways similar to Lestat in that particular movie, where he was someone that was buried for a long time, comes back, and is using somebody to basically help him with his cause. And that's somewhat similar to the vampire Lestat. And I always felt like if they were able to do that, have the time to develop that character in that capacity, we would have gotten a lot more, where maybe he was not in the film for that much, because he definitely wasn't in the film for that much, but when he is in the movie, I didn't feel much for the character at all. One particular scene I remembered specifically that I felt like could have been handled much more differently, where Julie finds Frey dug up, and Doug Barry, I should say, and then digs him out, and then he comes out of the coffin and he's clearly in a weakened state, and somehow manages to find the strength to crawl all the way to the barn. Now, you can certainly argue that vampires are a lot stronger than humans, if you will, and that does make sense. But for me, for someone who hasn't eaten for such a long time, it would be in such a fragile state that they wouldn't have the strength to get up from the coffin, let alone crawl all the way to the barn. If anything, and I understand maybe timing just was of the issue here, so they just had to take these creative licenses or liberties, I should say, and be able to tell in that manner, which I understand, and I'm not holding that against the film by any means, but if given the opportunity to have more time and more resources, there was a way that I believe that we could have had Julie taken the initiative to grab something to drag this guy, put him on a sled of some sort and drag him all the way to the barn. And then when she brings him over to the barn, one thing I left out too was the fact that he speaks a particular language that's obviously not English, considering that he's a Viking from way back in the day overseas, and then all of a sudden, like that, he's able to speak English, and I was like, where did he learn to speak English? It just came out of nowhere. And then one other thing too that I did not really care for much at all when it came to the character phrase, that whenever he spoke, he always growls, and he has a very a very amped up modulated type of voice with him to make it sound much more gravelly, and I just did not care for that at all. I actually wish that we just heard, I forgot the actor's name offhand, but I'm sure I'll have the image for you guys to see, but I would have preferred to have his actual voice heard in the movie rather than having it over modulated to give this emphasis of how that this is a very powerful being every time he spoke. I just didn't really care for all that, and the way that the transition from him becoming a more or less a full vampire, it was kind of abrupt and then didn't necessarily work for me all that well. So unfortunately for me, there's a lot of issues that I had with the film when it came to the overall execution. And the second time I saw the film, I will say though that when it came to learning more about the character of Julie, there's something about the way that her story was handled, where she starts off more or less innocent and then becomes corrupted in the story. I would have liked to have seen that flipped around. Well, maybe she wasn't as corrupted, like where she's been through the system enough to understand that, you know, these people are not good, and she's fully aware of that. And the very little, I guess, humanity she has left in her is with the kids that look up to her and like her a lot and want her to be a part of their lives. And she appreciates that aspect because it's a very genuine response from somebody that's not taking advantage of her, and seeing that very little humanity that's left over is still carrying her along the way, where she has something we can sympathize with her with. And then with the transition of her becoming a vampire, because she's been corrupted for throughout all these years in the system, that transition from her being this innocent flower to this corrupted vampire, if you will, that didn't work for me all that well. But having her little corruption in the beginning of the story with some humanity, and then the overall corruption of the vampire completely changes her over, and that would have made a lot more sense for me personally, which I think that could have worked out. Because then that way, if she does retaliate with the kids, she could say, well, you know, guys, just get over it, because this is the way the system is. You're only getting screwed over all the times anyway, so get used to it. And then that's how her mind is set up, because she's been through that and she doesn't know any other way, because unfortunately she's been, you know, more or less beaten through the system. So I would have liked to have seen something different on her handling of the handling of that character, I should say, that I would have appreciated a lot more. That would have made more sense for that transition from her being more or less an innocent flower to more or less a corrupted vampire, if you will. So a lot of issues that I have with the film, but I did appreciate the hard work that went into making this movie, and I actually liked the human side of the story rather than the vampire and the horror elements, because that to me was the least interesting part. Everything else outside of that was much more interesting. Unfortunately for me, the execution of the overall story didn't work all that well for me personally. So for me, that's going to be into my negatives. Now let's get into my rating. Now, as I said before, I didn't really like the film that much, but there are some great elements that I did appreciate about the movie that I've already mentioned before, in the positive and even parts of the negatives as well too. So despite the fact that I didn't like the film, I still would go out of my way to recommend to check out this movie, because I've actually come across quite a few reviews in IMDb where there were quite a few people that did enjoy the film, that did appreciate pretty much with what I said before about the human side of the story, which is much more of a dramatic film, more so than a horror movie, that a lot of people seem to connect with more. And there were a few others that just did not like the film at all whatsoever. But unfortunately for me, as I said before, I didn't really connect with the film. I did appreciate what they're trying to go for, and I understood what they were going for. But I think a lot of it simply has to do with the fact that if they had more time, obviously more money, more resources, that we probably could have got a better film, for me personally, as far as how they could have executed the overall story, because all the elements were there, all the components were there. It just didn't work for me overall with the end product here. But despite me saying that here, I still say that the movie's still worth a shot. And those are my thoughts on the film. Now, if you guys have seen this movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on this film here. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel and share, like, videos, hit the notification bell while you're down there as well too. And also follow NRW on social media, on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, on Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. You can follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. On Twitter, You're So Cool with WRM. And on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And until next time, everybody, stay safe out there. Have a wonderful Halloween season, I meant to say. And check out my next review that's going to be coming out real soon, which I can't wait to share with you guys. I don't want to reveal what it is, because I think it'd be exciting for me just to drop it and for you guys to check it out, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it as well too, as much as I did. So until then, stay safe out there, and cheers.